that Buddhism was in Africa thousands of years before there ever was a religion called Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. The Buddhist religion were the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus. British historian Godfrey Higgins wrote about a world that was once a Buddhist. Archaeological signs show remnants of an advanced civilization that Godfrey Higgins speaks about. In every account we find early statues of the black Buddhist god. Godfrey Higgins names Egyptians Hermes Trismegistus as the elder Buddha, and he names Shakyamuni Buddha of India as the young Buddha. All of the ancient statues of the Buddha is that of a black man. Now, let us move back to the issue of Christ was a Buddhist. Please understand that British historian Higgins notes that the ancient Egyptians were Buddhists and Hermes Trismegistus was the elder Buddha. Now, the name Hermes Trismegistus, that is the name that the Greeks used when they described him in Greek culture, but he was named Tahiti. You know, he had Thor by the Africans or the Egyptians. Now, let us look at how Godfrey Higgins described how Brahmin teachings got affected in Africa. It was a Brahmin who brought their teachings into Africa. People got his name mixed up. The word a Brahmin later became known as Abraham. The story of Adam and Eve was described by Godfrey Higgins as an age of ignorance. We have people today in 2014 who are fighting the perpetual Brahmin teachings of creation theory as opposed to the theory of evolutions, which is commensurate with Buddhist teachings. Now, let me share with you empirical evidence how Buddha became Christ as opposed to how Christ became a Buddhist. The Buddhism or the teachings of wisdom have been around thousands of years before Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Concretely, the Buddha Shakyamuni in India emerged about 600 years before anyone had ever heard of a Jesus Christ. The ancient Buddhist text, the Vinaya Pitaka, mentions the Brahmin of Nubian Sudan in the ancient capital of Ethiopia at Meroe around the 4th century, before the Christian era. Shakyamuni Buddhism was in Africa 400 years before Christianity. Please note that Shakyamuni's Buddhism was in Africa, meaning Ethiopia, Meroe, Egypt, and Axum. In ancient times, Meroe was the Ethiopian capital. Axum was known in the old days as Abyssinia. We have archaeological evidence of Buddhism and Buddhism being in ancient Africa. Look, read all of the ancient Greek historians, Patriarch, Alexander the Great, Darius, Latarius, Strabo, Philo, Judaeus, Titus, Flavius, Clemens, and all the white historians confirm about the Buddhists and Buddhism coming to Greece, Rome, and Ethiopia, and the Axum, Egypt, Persia, Babylonia, Arab, Jerusalem, and all over the world. The ancient world knew about the world-honored one called the Buddha, who later became known as Christ. Now, let's understand, in our Western culture, we were brought up to believe that the story of Christ was the greatest story ever told. We at the Proud Black Buddhist World Association hold that the story of how the Buddha became Christ is the greatest story untold. So, when you study Christianity, about the Christian religion, they teach you, or we're taught, that the story of Christ is the greatest story ever told. Well, we at the Proud Black Buddhist Association have the greatest story untold. And the greatest story untold is the fact that Christ was not only a Buddhist, Christ was the Buddha himself. To understand how Shakyamuni's Buddhism got into the Middle East, we must start with the Greek king, Alexander the Great. Story in world history is about Alexander the Buddhist and how the Buddhist religion became part of Greek culture and history. When Alexander went to conquer India, this young boy met with Buddhists in India, and it was meeting Buddhism that not only changed Greek culture helped to usher in a new Buddhist paradigm of Mahayana Buddhism that traveled to Asian countries of China, Korea, Japan, and other countries. Before Buddhism had ever even made it to Asia, Buddhism was in Greece. Now, let us look at a picture of a Greek Buddha located in the Tokyo National Museum. Imagine the fact that Buddhism was in Greece over 800 years before it was in Japan. Over the years, we have met many Japanese priests who act as if they are the masters of Buddhism. When you study Buddhist history, you learn that the Africans and the early Greeks were Buddhists. Now, let me make a side historical note. Prior to Buddha Shakyamuni of India, there existed a black Buddhist culture in the world. Now, Buddhists were not called Buddhists, they were called gymnosophists. Gym means naked and sophist means philosopher. Gymnosophers were the Buddhist priests who made a great influence on Alexander the Great. Buddhism emerged in the world stage as an intricate part of Greek history and development. Gymnosophers were not new to Greek historians who visited Africa. They wrote about these Buddhists. However, it was only when Alexander the Great and his men met with Buddhists that they would change the dynamic of Buddhist and Greek culture. Let us share a great history. Not Alexander was said to have been taught by Aristotle. Aristotle was taught by Socrates, who was black and Buddhist. Socrates had been introduced to Buddhism, and he was a gnostic, meaning knowledge. Look up the word metempsychosis. It is the same as reincarnation. People, let's understand. Let's go into this Greek history. Now, unknown to most people, what is known as Hellenist philosophy or Greek culture is an syncretic system of West and East. Buddhism became an intricate part of Greek culture. Just Google the word Greco-Buddhism. Socrates, a Buddhist, taught Plato. Plato taught Aristotle, and Aristotle taught a young Alexander. It was no mystery why Alexander the Great was fascinated with Buddhists, who were called gymnosophers or naked philosophers when he came to India. The Greek philosopher Pythagoras was a Buddhist. The Buddhists were called Sanmediums. Look at Pythagoras, or the Pythagorean theory. Look at the Gnosticisms, were just Greek forms of Buddhism. The influence of Alexander the Great explains how the Buddha Shakyamuni of India became Christ. See, Buddhism deals with the law of cause and effect. We will give you the cause and effect relationship as to how the Buddha became Christ. When Alexander the Great tried to expand into India, this is the time in our history when the East meets West. Alexander did not make it all the way into India, and then he got turned around by the Nadas. We will tell you that story in another lecture, how the Nadas conquered the Miriam Empire, which brought in Ashoka, but that's a different lecture. Now, what happened, however, was the land of India leading up to India that he did conquer, the generous set kingdoms, whereas the Greco-Buddhist syncretic culture emerged that allowed Buddhism to become a part of Greek culture. This culture was called Hellenism. Hellenism was a Buddhist Greek culture people. Alexander the Great died, I think around 33 years old. He was a young man, but his generals occupied the land near India and all over the world, and this culture of Hellenism spread it in that part of the world. Now, there are many names that Buddhists were called. They were most known as Gymnosophists or Sanmedians. The Sanmedians were the dedicated Buddhist priests who introduced Buddhism to Greek culture. The Sanmedians of India later became known as the Greek religious order known as Essenes. They were the Jewish. The Essenes practiced all kinds of teachings. They didn't just study the teachings of Shakyamuni. They studied the teachings of Hermes. They studied all the great Egyptian sciences. There's a word called therapeutiae that comes from the Buddhist word theravana. The therapeutiae were the Jewish Hellenist Buddhist priests. Most Christians can follow the story in that they know from Christian history that the Persians conquered Jerusalem and took all the Jews to Babylon. When Alexander the Great conquered Persia, the Greeks let the Jews go back home to Jerusalem. The therapeutiae were the Jewish Buddhists who lived in the Hellenistic Greek empires. One such group of therapeutiae were the Essenes. To understand how the Buddha became Christ, let us look at the teachings of the king of Judea called Alexander Jannaeus, known to some as King Jonathan, the king of Judea. Let us stop for a minute because what I'm about to say will blow your mind. The Jewish king Alexander Jannaeus was a Buddhist. He did not call himself a Buddhist. He was in essence a priest who lived the Buddhist lifestyle. They were vegetarians, knowledgeable, and they lived in a compound with other priests. The Essenes got into bloody battles. Let's take a closer look at the Essenes. To get an understanding as to how Christ was a Buddhist, we have to go before the reported time of Christ and meet Hebrew king Alexander Jannaeus. Alexander Jannaeus was not just some Buddhist in Jerusalem. Alexander Jannaeus was the king and high priest in Jerusalem who got into bloody wars with the Pharisees or the Jewish priests. Jewish history tells us of bloody battles between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, the Jewish-Buddhist connection happened when Jewish high priest and king Alexander Jannaeus became an Essene. Now, let's go back into history. The Buddhist king Ashoka sent missionaries to the Greece hundreds of years before Alexander Jannaeus. He sent missionaries known as therapeutiae. Now, this name arrived from Theravada Buddhism. Now, a culture emerged in Greece and in that part of the world. Simply put, a group of Buddhists who had a high level of religion were called the Essenes, and the high priest king Alexander Jannaeus was a Buddhist or an Essenes. Now, they simply put, they taught the Buddhist Dharma. How do we know this? The Hebrew king left us a minute coin of the Dharma wheel. The story of Christ in the Bible is the story of Buddha challenging the Pharisees. Alexander Jannaeus lost the battle against the Pharisees and he had to retreat into the mountains. And we heard no more from him until 1946 when someone discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the writings of the Essenes. What you have seen is an excerpt from our full lecture, Christ is a Buddha, or Christ was the Buddha. So please, maybe you may not want to see the whole lecture because the whole lecture runs just over an hour, but you can take this in bits and pieces. So hope that you're enjoying yourself and you're enjoying the lecture, Christ is a Buddhist. Just click on the next one and get to the next lecture. And